We are here with Senator Scott Martin, Majority Leader of the Senate Appropriations Committee. What needs to be worked out before this year's state budget is passed?
Well, certainly, couple of the big ticket items that the Commonwealth are facing right now is first and foremost is our structural deficit. Currently the Commonwealth is spending about $3 billion more than what it's taking in revenue. Secondarily, probably the health and condition of the state's rainy day fund. We went from being one of the worst states in the country. I think we had enough money in reserve to operate state government for 10 minutes coming out of the pandemic. And we really fought hard in negotiating to build that up. And we're sitting at about $7.4 billion, which is right at the standard of where we should be, about 14%. And that's led to us having, positive outlooks by the rating agencies, better bond ratings, so when we can try to get better rates and pay less on our debt. And we've actually saved, I think, with just the last two reissuances alone and refinancings, about $171 million for taxpayers. Of course, then you have the typical battles that are going on in state government, where you'll have the discussions about what will be the appropriate spend for public K through 12 education dollars. Especially in light of the fact that we're seeing a declining enrollment of our young people across the state. Some areas have lost almost 20% of their enrollment, other areas 15%. And it's projected over the next decade to go down by another 17% across the entire state. So what does that mean in terms of education funding? Medicaid is another huge issue, probably one of the most impactful issues financially to the Commonwealth's budget. And of course, it's very intertwined with the federal government. Federal government typically covers about, in the ballpark, about 60% of costs, and the state picks up the 40%. So we're watching very closely what's happening in Washington, D.C. You see any discussions they may have, we're very leery. Are they relieving us of certain mandates? Are they going to try to push costs onto us? And it's not just Medicaid. It could be a program like SNAP, the nutrition program. It could be federal education-related funding and how that comes about. And it's not very easy to deal with, given the fact that they're on an October budget cycle when we're supposed to be done by June 30th. So what happens there is you don't want to pass the budget and all of a sudden find out that you have multi-billion dollars worth of commitments that you're now responsible for, perhaps, as the federal government picks up, finishes its budget. And I think finally, the other big thing, which has probably been a hot button item in the media, is transit funding across the state. I'm sure people have heard of it. The governor is proposing another $250 million of sales tax revenue to be given to our transit services. Obviously, we have some concerns. We're willing to work with them on it if they're willing to work on some of our other priorities to reduce the structural deficit. But, as it stands now, Pennsylvania is the fourth highest state in the country in terms of transit funding. And the lion's share of that, $1.5 billion, already goes to SEPTA in the Southeast. And so there's concerns from a lot of folks up here because of the fact that ridership has been down tremendously. Public safety has been a huge issue on their system, hence why the General Assembly had to create a special prosecutor. And we also had to increase penalties for people who assault drivers and other operators of the systems. They have a lot of fare jumpers. I think it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars that are owed to them from people who are basically jumping the fare jumpers and not paying to get on. So probably the biggest issue, though, is, every other system around the state goes through these efficiency evaluations with their routes, what's utilized, what's not, how can we bolster it. And SEPTA never really finished that. They actually admitted they paused it because they wanted to wait to see where the money goes. Well, it was kind of unacceptable for all of us who have transit agencies that went through that process. So it's a very frustrating conversation. But again, given the nature of divided government, we're willing to have those discussions, but there needs to be some accountability in it, and we need to start closing the state structural deficit, because quite frankly, if we don't do or make some changes this year, what the Commonwealth could be faced with exactly 1 year from now, or what it will be faced with, quite frankly, is we'll be faced with a potential $5.5 to $6 billion hole with no money in reserves, no money in the fund, the rainy day fund, And in that scenario, you have three options. There's either going to be massive increase in taxes, massive program cuts, or third is a combination of both. And so we're going to try our best to avoid that scenario and maintain our fiscal stability. And those have kind of been some of the big parts of budget discussions so far.
You mentioned one of your priorities being education, and there was a bill that passed the House recently to limit cyber charter schools to $8,000 in funding per student. I know that cyber charter schools is part of the school funding discussion. How do you feel about that bill specifically?
Well, I don't think that bill's going anywhere, but quite frankly, if you recall, Governor Wolf used to actually propose $9,000 back before even COVID. So we actually employed the Independent Fiscal Office, and they worked with the Wolf's Department of Education to verify the numbers. And back then, the number that they came with to operate basic education was $14,000. So that was in 2018 or 2019. Here we are in 2025. Are we saying that the cost to provide that educational cyber education has gone down? The thing I'm more in favor of when we look at the cyber charter issue is I would be fine with a statewide rate. But because unfortunately right now you can have a classroom of 20 kids and all 20 of those kids could be paying a different rate because there's 500 different funding formulas with the different school districts across Pennsylvania. I personally believe that we should take this out of the school district's purview, get rid of all the bureaucracy of the paying back and forth. But if that kid leaves and goes to cyber, that money should stay with us. We'll pay them directly. We had one statewide rate, one contract to be signed, have expectations. I think it would take the politics out of a lot of the choice versus anti-choice movement and protect families' options in terms of having that to their kids. But remember, in this discussion, the one thing I always remind people is usually when a family member moves a child out of the public school system, it's for a reason. And what is that reason? Is it the school wasn't adequately meeting what they thought their child needed to be proficient in reading or math or science? Could it be that the child was a victim of assault of some sort? And I've had some real hard cases that we've had to deal with as well. But there's always a reason for doing it. And of course, cyber charter enrollment numbers exploded during COVID because there's a lot of public schools out there in certain parts of the state that were closed for almost a year and a half. And so the families needed a new option, whether they couldn't understand why is that Catholic school across the street open, but my public school hasn't been open for a year and a half, or a cyber charter opportunity or a brick and mortar cyber charter. So, I mean, the issue isn't as black and white as some people make it to be. I personally think the $8,000 number was chosen specifically to capture as many schools as possible. So more schools it would be a savings to a school district because that's part of the problem here with all these funding formulas. Depending on the number you pick, for a lot of schools it would be an increase. For a lot of schools it would be a decrease. That's not really taking into consideration what the true cost is to do it. And if we could get to that number and get to a new solution like the one I'm proposing, I think we could have a much better resolution to this issue, protect the parents' right to find a setting that's best for their kids, and also save school districts money too.
You mentioned decreasing number of students at schools in Pennsylvania. What is causing that?
Well, I think it's many different things. First and foremost is, people aren't having as many kids as they used to. So that birth replacement rate is an issue. We've also had a lot of movement outside of the state in terms of people being lured to other places, whether it's southeastern United States, going to Florida during COVID because there was, it was less restrictions down there. But a lot of folks don't realize is that our fastest growing age demographic in the Commonwealth is 80 and above. And when you couple that with the fact that they're also our most expensive demographic, think long-term care and other senior-related services. And on the other side of the equation, our future workforce, our future tax base continues to shrink. Matter of fact, 2 years ago, we just had the smallest kindergarten enrollment statewide since 1986. That's going to be moving its way through. So that's why we've been trying our best to be very focused on how do we make this state more competitive in terms of luring investment and job opportunities. But you've also seen us try to be more creative. If you were familiar with last year, I had authored a bill called the Grow PA program, which basically offered in-state students that if you pick a high demand major, we will give you money to go into that high demand field. And the deal is you're agreeing, you'll never have to pay it back if you agree to work in that high demand field in PA and live in Pennsylvania. We also have a sister component of that for out of state students as well, very similar, but they get the in state rate versus out of state. So that'd be a win for everybody if we can get more kids to stay here or new ones to relocate here. They have less debt, so hopefully they're planting their roots here sooner. Hopefully getting married, falling in love, having kids. But we have to try to turn around this demographic decline because, quite frankly, it's probably the number one threat to the Commonwealth and its stability in the future.
Raising the minimum wage and regulating skill games were two things from last year's budget that carried over into this year's budget. Where do those two issues stand this year?
So probably first and foremost, the game of skills one is something we're really keeping our eye on. That's been battled back and forth for a while and trying to find a landing ground or a consensus agreement area as to where you should have certain rates, how they should be regulated. It certainly is having an impact on things like the lottery fund. So, we are hopeful that we can land this year. It has been an issue. It's an out-of-state companies that will operate a lot of these things, and basically there's billions of dollars being made that are going out the door tax-free in Pennsylvania. And that's at the expense of a lot of other things. We also have little mini casinos popping up in different neighborhoods that some of them truly are the skill games, but others are these refurbished, they look like skill games, but they're legitimately refurbished slot machines from other countries, other states, that have been repurposed and people think they're playing a skill game. So there's certainly an aspect of that we want to get under consideration. When you talk about raising the minimum wage, you do hear it from some specified groups pushing that. And there's a lot of things to consider when you talk about that. I can tell you that a lot of the tipped workforce does not want to see that messed with. They are absolutely love how the system treats them or the money they make through tips right now. You certainly have many in the nonprofit community who are worried about their ability to be able to pay it depending on what their industry is. And then those who are engaged in contracts, maybe unionized contracts that might have provisions that say if the minimum wage is increased, every single person gets what that increase is. And so there's other considerations in that. We don't hear about it as much as people may think based on what you might see in the news sometimes. And of course, there are studies that show there will be some job loss if it came to that. It's only natural, or you see prices increase on certain products, and that's on top of an environment where costs have already been up for certain goods and services. But listen, at the end of the day, I know years ago there was a deal struck to raise it a little bit, and in exchange for working on overtime rules, things that were back and forth with the Wolf administration. You never rule anything out. However, it's got to be give and take when it comes to a lot of these issues.
Lastly, you mentioned being concerned about the state's spending deficit, and I know that the governor proposed using, if skill games do get regulated, using that money along with closing the Delaware loophole. And I know that legalized adult use marijuana didn't make it past the Senate, but it was brought up as a potential to bring in that revenue. If none of these things go through, how else would you like to see that money come back in?
All right. Well, a couple things. First and foremost, so all the viewers understand is the governor basically took his proposals from last year on adult use recreational and games of skill. In adult use recreational, he multiplied his revenue by 2. And he also started spending some of the money this year, which state government never would get a system up and running that quickly. On games of skill, he took the revenue number and he multiplied it by 5. It's just not realistic. And secondarily, I'll say this, that is only a tiny fraction of what would cover the state structural deficit, even if those two things went through. The bottom line is that there are things that are occurring. Give you one example, GLP-1 drugs, weight loss drugs, Ozempics, think of that. There's been a tremendous impact because doctors are writing these out so much as a weight loss means, not just for people with diabetes or prediabetes, that the MCOs are coming back, the managed care organizations, saying it's having close to $1 billion impact on Medicaid in this state. When you think about the administration going for things like an 1115 waiver because they wanted to pay rental costs for inmates coming out of prisons for 6 months or pay for their pots and pans or furniture or at-home grocery delivery services, things well beyond the scope of Medicaid. And, those add up. Just those two ideas alone would cost the state 1.6 billion and cost the federal government 3.5 billion. And so what we're trying to do is how can we get guardrails on things, get people to have some skin in the game? Because quite frankly, the position of the state, and I go back to what we talked about earlier, we have to grow. And in order to grow, we have to compete with other states to get people to want to make Pennsylvania their home. And so government spending is not going to lead us to prosperity. It's how do we make ourselves more competitive? And are they going to a state that is financially and fiscally stable? And that's what's at stake this year. And if we don't get spending under control with this budget, it's going to be a very long budget process. Because I, for one, especially in my role as appropriations chair, who looks at the numbers every day, who wants to put the Commonwealth in that position? And especially, it's going to be the gubernatorial election year. Half the Senate's on the ballot, all the House. It's not very tenuous. And so sometimes you have to agree to make certain types of changes to programs in order to try to save us some money. The other hope, and I don't want to diminish this, is that there's always a hope that we can see the economy start to grow, because when the economy grows or you have economic growth, typically tax revenues grow. And so that kind of activity actually helps us in this financial predicament that we're in.
Senator Scott Martin, Majority Leader of the Senate Appropriations Committee, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.